Let's go. All right, welcome everyone. Today we have Nick Barger here from Kehi Distributors.
Let's go.
So today, this conversation, what I wanted to do with some of these interviews is talk to non-designers, but people who are an integral part of the product design process. Obviously, developers are a huge part because they create the code that then is pushed out to the people to use. So I think designers and developers need to work really closely together and understand each other's process. So that's why I have Nick here today. He is the director of engineering and has held many other roles in development, but I'll let you talk about that, Nick. Welcome.
Sure. Yeah, thank you. Thanks for spending this time with me today. And it'd be nice to kind of talk a little bit about how the design perspective is versus development perspective goes, and just see where this thing takes us, I guess.
Awesome. So what is, really quick, what is your current, what has been your experience so far? Because I know you've worked you work at a big corporation now, you worked at some startups.
Sure. Yeah. So I've been in a couple different industries. I was in e-commerce in some big players in the e-commerce space. I've been in insurance. I've been in medical device. I've been in aviation for several years. And some of those companies are really big companies, and some of them are quite a bit smaller and more on the startup side of things. And I know I always have my own kind of projects and experimentation going on, and so always a lot of things that I like to get my hands into.
So as a designer, I always say, like, what is your product design process? But you're a developer, so what does your product development process look like, and how does design fit into that?
Sure. Yeah. So a lot of people, when they're trying to build software products, especially bigger companies, the startups are not as much to this, but bigger companies, they tend to try to plan everything out. They try to, get a lot of the requirements. They try to design everything on in some kind of design tool, and then they kind of hand off the work to development, and that's sounding very much like Waterfall, right? I mean, it's very, very heavy Waterfall process. And even companies that are doing Agile, they'll start doing Agile like right then, right? That's the point where so all this work has been done, all this design has been done, and they'll start doing Agile like then.
Yeah.
So I try a little bit more to kind of bring that process a little bit more upstream, and to get developers a little bit more involved in the initial understanding of the problem, the initial design and discussion with users. And so really development for me is something where I like to try to work hand in hand with design, and hand in hand with the maybe BAs or product owners or the stakeholders, the customers themselves, and get developers a little bit more involved early on.
That's awesome.
And then and then what we like to do oftentimes is we like to use some of these tools, these very lightweight tools, things that even us developers can use in a design capacity. And little plug for Balsamiq, but Balsamiq is a tool that I've used for several years, where we can kind of just do a bit of back of the napkin kind of sketching, but do it in an electronic way, and that we can share, we can talk about, and we can use that to base a lot of these kind of initial ideas, product ideas on. And then as we go, we tend to allow a lot of iteration in that aspect, and we take certain parts of those Balsamiq wireframes and we start to detail those in a bit more high fidelity. So developers are thinking about how they're going to build it, how it's going to work, how it's going to function. But they're also thinking about aesthetics too. Developers do care a lot about design. At least they should. At least I hope they do.
Some do.
Ours do.
Yeah.
So anyways, we like to work hand in hand, but those designers really then excel at doing some of those high fidelity pieces, and it's kind of at that point where the high fidelity starts coming in, that we start to maybe switch tools to something more like designers may use Sketch or Photoshop or something like that. But what I love is then putting it into something else where we can all see and interact with it. We use InVision, but there's lots of other tools out there. And it gives us the ability to comment on things and to assess it. And then oftentimes we'll go right back to Balsamiq and do more iterations,
That's
and
awesome.
change it up,
So you hit on some interesting words that are used in product design development. So methodologies of Waterfall and Agile. So I just kind of want to explain those really quickly. Also use the word iteration, which I love, because that means you continue to go back and refine. So you go out and you learn something, or you talk to stakeholders and you make adjustments. So that's a big part of it. But then back to the methodologies. These are all methodologies that started in software development, right? Agile and Waterfall. And now they sort of moved into the whole product development cycle, which I think is interesting. Just a quick little glossary. A Waterfall is pretty old school. I know it's still used, but maybe you can quickly dive into what that is, or I can, I don't care, and then do the same for Agile. Does it really quick, like this is what they mean, you know?
Sure, yeah. So, I mean, with Waterfall, and I'll probably get some kind of technical, someone would probably argue about the technical but for me, Waterfall is really, you're doing a lot of activities that have to happen very sequentially, and they have to get all the way to their completion before the next step can start, right? So, we're going to do all of the requirement gathering before we do any kind of design work. We're going to do all the design work until we do any kind of development. We're going to do all the development until we do any kind of testing, We're going to do all the testing until it's perfect, and then we're going to release it, And in that process, certainly requirements change better. There's more knowledge, more understanding. We pivot. We learn things. So oftentimes, you may not end up where you kind of want to be at the end, and it's a little bit rougher kind of process in many ways. But that being said, Waterfall, has maybe somewhat of a negative connotation in the software development world. There's still a lot of really important use cases, where, trying something out and seeing how it works doesn't work really well in certain, medical device,
Exactly.
products.
I was thinking engineering, it's extremely important.
Yeah. So if you build a bridge, you probably want to be pretty sure that it's going to work at the end of it,
Yeah. Luckily, software, not, no one's going to get hurt if it's not built properly. Maybe their feelings, but that's it. Or
Now, with that being said, on the Agile side, we're talking about iterations. We're really into, whether you do it in a 1 week or a 2 week sprints or 2 week iterations, doesn't really matter to me. In fact, we do things. We experiment on a daily basis with things, and we try to deploy all the time. Every day, we try to deploy to production. Without bypassing quality and things like that. But we're doing it because we're trying to validate, truly validate whether our assumptions are right. Those assumptions might be business requirement assumptions. They might be technical assumptions, but oftentimes they're also design assumptions. How many times have we argued, as teams where we think this is a good design choice? There's a lot of great good principles on it. Our UX people have said this is going to make a lot of sense, but you don't really know until it gets out there, and you get that feedback. So we always try to shorten that cycle and then do things really fact-based. And again, I keep kind of bringing it back to the tools, but I think the tools really help us in that. And the more lightweight we can keep everything, the more, the quicker process we can do and not get hung up too much on really spending a lot of time in one space, the faster we can get out to production and realize whether we got it right or wrong, and then make corrections,
It's all in the name, right? It's agility. It's being able to shift around. And I know it's really popular. I've worked in Agile a lot doing software. I know you have. And it's kind of like the go-to. Okay, so thanks. That was great. I think my next question now is, we've learned a lot about process, the whole process of creating, which I think was awesome outline. My next question is, what are some ways designers and developers can complement each other? Work well together.
Yeah. I think actually one of the best things to do with designers, developers is to work really close together. I love the idea of designers, being involved in the technical side of a product, and I love the idea of developers being involved in the design side of a product. We all are good at, the thing that we're professionals in, right? I'm a good developer. You may be a good designer, kind of deal.
Maybe.
You are.
Who knows? I don't know.
I've worked with you in the past, so I can actually say you are a good designer. I was trying to generalize.
We've actually paired together, and we've done awesome things.
That's right. But I can play a development role, but that doesn't mean that I have no design input whatsoever, or that I couldn't to some degree sit down and uh, push through and get some kind of design, stuff done, and have an input on that. And just the same way, you as a designer can absolutely understand and contribute to the technical side of things in a ton of different ways.
There's always been a long debate if designers should code, and I don't know if that's the right terminology, because I feel like designers don't need to be able to code, but they should understand what's happening. They should be able to maybe read the code and understand what it does. Maybe not in detail, but I sort of understand what's happening here. I understand how this technology is working. I understand how the API, like if we're using an API, I understand that we need to get the data from the API that will do this to that, and this is where it's coming in. And I think all that's important. I think understanding CSS is important. The visual framework, I think all that's really important. And I think the same for a developer, where they understand why the design system was built that way, why the UI looks that way.
Yeah, no, I think so too. I mean, I think it's just understanding each other's worlds a little bit better, right? And I think that's useful. And I think the other thing that is great too is sitting down side by side and working together. And I really do mean side by side. Letting the designer have an input into the execution of it being done. And the opposite side too, having the developer have a say into what's going to be the usability of this on a phone, and maybe this needs to be a little bit bigger or something like that, or maybe because of performance reasons I need to we need to slightly change that control or something like that, whatever it may be. But I think having that back and forth exchange as a partnership is really, really good, and not so much as a waterfall on either direction of saying I did my work and I threw it over to this side, and back again.
I feel like that's how it has been set up. And what we're talking about, there's a name for it. It's called pairing. That's in like a product design. In working in a software company, that's typically called pairing. We worked that way a little bit, which was great. I also think it's really important. I do think not all designers, not all developers like it, which is surprising to me, but I think it's really fun. It's like I get to watch my flat, images turn into something real. And I think it's great. And I think you touched on all the right points. We learn from each other the limitations. Like you maybe make something, but then I would be able to tell you if it's usable or not in a better way. Like I'll have an understanding of why that might not be usable from my knowledge as a designer. And you would have like the ability to say like, well, that's technically possible, but also might take a long time, or that is not technically possible. We don't even have that data, So there's a lot that you can work with and get accomplished instead of trying to send that over email or Slack or something,
Yeah.
Okay. My next question is, what should every designer know about the world of development? It seems like a big question.
Yeah, geez. What should every designer know? I think there's a couple things. I think somebody recently brought me into this term, API, right? Assume positive intent. Software developers always have API as something else, but this other one, assume positive intent. 99 times out of 100, I truly believe that we're all working together, with the intent to make the product better, to help the end customer, to be good, to one another, kind of deal. And yet sometimes there's conflict, between designers and developers in both directions. And I think designers and developers should really assume positive intent, that we're trying to work together for the best possible product that we can do. And we all have opinions on that, and I think listening to each other about that is really important. The other thing is, maybe a little bit more discreetly, more and more developers. You have front-end developers, you got back-end developers, but if you can give us the hex codes, that's just so much easier. Just do that.
Just give me the hex codes. Yeah. So one thing that I had written that we talked about was something you actually talked about early on in our conversation, which is that engineers should really be involved from the beginning of a project too, because that's something that even still happens in like a more modern company where it's like the product owner with the designer and the stakeholder, and they're like, here's our idea, and then the developer's like, I have 17 questions now. I'm like, that's not good. So, um, but we don't have to. I could totally edit that out. So, or maybe just edit out what I just said about editing it out. We'll see. Um, but no, I think it's great, and I like this API term, and now I want it to be a T-shirt. My next question, I just have two more. My next question is that, and this is something that we've talked about before, and I think it's extremely interesting just from my background, but UX and design thinking are really hot like buzzwords nowadays. So how do you feel about this from the development perspective?
So like the difference between UX and UI,
Just the fact that now it's like a big deal because I mean, it is now, and it used to not really be. People didn't have UX teams, and they,
right.
I mean, I was like CEOs are talking about design thinking and how it's important for the growth of their company.
Yeah, it's been interesting to see that progression, right? There was a time where really there. Well, I didn't know the term UX for sure. It's just like you had graphic designers is what I think we always called people, right? And you had developers and you had graphic designers. Now we have software engineers, and we have UX, and we have UI, and we have Scrum masters and all kinds of stuff. But I think I think in the world kind of realized that design is hard. Not just the aesthetics of things, but the usability, the functionality. What we're even building, is it the right target? Kind of deal. And my thing on it is, I believe strongly that UX is the responsibility of everyone. Everybody who's building that product should be thinking about, how do I make this? How do I really solve the pain that customer is having? How do I really make this product the best that it can be? And if it's not user friendly, if it's not to the point, if it's not serving a specific purpose, then we've missed the mark, right? We haven't done a good job. Now I think people have just been so bad at that in the past that now we have dedicated professionals to do that. Yeah. But in truth, I think it's really useful to have everybody with that mindset. And the UX, the designated UX term to me, are maybe the guides to help the rest of the team understand and think in that direction.
Yeah.
And I think if there's one more thing, that's a little bit unsolicited opinion,
but
there's one more thing. I really love the idea of UX people still retaining or still trying to build up their UI skills.
Yeah, I think that's really important.
Yeah, I know there's a lot of people who they're pure UX research, and there's nothing wrong with that. But I think of it in my world more like engineers or architects, software architects, who only do whiteboard design. They come up with these brilliant architectures and designs, technical designs on the whiteboard, and when they go to actually put it into practice, somebody else does the engineering work, somebody else does the development work, and oftentimes that act of engineering, it facilitates the discovery and the design itself. So it comes out a little bit different. And so I just think that's important. I think UX gets that value when they sit down sometimes and apply their research and design, and they maybe tweak it a little bit then, and it just comes out better.
That's really cool. I think that's awesome. It's interesting that I was talking about design thinking and you were talking about putting the user at the center, because like another way to describe design thinking is actually the human-centered design process. So I should maybe call it that. I should refer to it more than that than design thinking, but it is interesting, and I think that's so true, and I love it. So my last question is, where do you see, or where do you think the product development industry is heading? So what I really mean by that is a lot more companies now are creating, instead of just having like the IT department, they have really like a product engineer, and they're thinking in terms of product. So it's becoming a thing just like UX and user-centered design and design thinking. So where do you think this is headed?
Well, I think it's maturing, right? I think we're all getting a little bit better at it. There's certain companies that lead the way, and they do this better than others. For sure. your pure software companies, a lot of these startups, a lot of these major tech companies, they do a really great job at this, right?
Yeah.
And now, because everybody is doing the same thing, all these mainstream companies that technology and software and products as their revenue that's not what their main business is. They may be in distribution, they may be in medical, they may be in whatever, advertising, because all these other companies are trying to emulate this, right? There's a bit of a imitation going on, and they're not quite yet as comfortable. It's not as natural in the culture, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that will come, but it'll come in time. And so right now we're going to have a lot of people that are just trying to emulate and trying to learn, and that's good, but we have to give it a little bit of time to mature. And I think the tide will rise. All these people will know how to do this. They'll become very experienced in it. We'll have better and better products. And, we'll probably have a much bigger talent pool that knows how to do it. Because right now it's hard to find people who are really, really good at it.
That's really true. Yeah. In conclusion, thank you for joining me. I really appreciate it. I think the insights are really interesting. That people who don't, or maybe aren't developers and maybe aren't designers, but they're even like just project owners or product managers or something, they could really understand sort of what goes into this whole process. So I appreciate it. Thank you, Nicholas. I keep calling you Nick. I'm saying Nicholas from now on.
Either way, man.
Either way.
All right. Well, thanks again. I appreciate it.
All right.
Bye.
And I'm going to stop the video.